Welcome, everyone. I am Israel Ganot from AGP Ventures from Ra'anana, Israel, along with David Yahid, our Chief Marketing Officer. Hi, David.
Hi, good to be here.
Welcome to the latest edition of AGP Access, which is our series at connecting Israeli companies to the US market. By way of introduction, if you don't know AGP, we are an early stage venture capital firm. We invest exclusively in Israeli startups. We have offices in both Boston and Tel Aviv. And our mission, as I said, is to connect Israeli founders to the US market. And one of the ways that we do that is through interactive forums such as this one. So before I go ahead and introduce our exciting speaker for tonight, I'm just going to have David introduce our partners and sponsors.
So like Israel said, we have a very exciting speaker, and we have a lot of partners that are supporting us today. So first of all, I want to thank Kickstart, leading PR agency specializing in working with VCs and foreign companies looking to enter the American market. We want to thank GCMO, Israel, an exclusive invite-only community for CMOs working out of Israel with global companies. Startup Grind, which is a global startup community that designed to educate, inspire, and connect entrepreneurs in over 125 countries. Pearl Cohen, an international law firm with offices in the United States, Israel, and the United Kingdom, whose priority is to provide innovative legal advice with maximum commercial impact. Penguin Strategies, a leading global B2B tech marketing agency and RevUps agency here in Israel that works with hypergrowth companies. And Mind Media, which is we're sitting in their beautiful studio right now, and they are an income-driven digital media agency helping mission-driven brands and communities tell their story and maximize their circle of influence.
Great, thanks, David. So I'm really excited, very honored to have Gary Briggs with us tonight. So Gary and I have known each other for almost 2 decades at this point, going back to our days together at eBay and PayPal. Since then, Gary has served on a variety of marketing executive roles at some of the most prominent companies in Silicon Valley. I mentioned eBay, PayPal, then Google, Motorola, and of course, his 5 years as Facebook's Chief Marketing Officer. And today, he also serves on public boards of category leaders such as Etsy and Petco. There's no question in my mind that when it comes to social media, consumer marketing, marketplaces, there's really no better person to have on today's show than Gary Briggs. So welcome, Gary. Exciting to have you here today.
Thanks. Well, let's just move on from all that and talk about
it. So we're going to dig deeper there, Gary.
What an entrance.
Oh, my Lord. And thanks to the sponsors, all those things I need or have needed at some point. So that's all good things. It's all fun.
Great. So Gary, obviously you've had an amazing career working at really companies that have shaped our lives and defined categories over the years. Share with us a little bit about your journey, your career journey, just to get started.
Yeah, I mean, a bunch of it is, and I don't mean to be demure. I mean, a bunch of it is luck and timing. And I can go into some detail. There's like this serendipitousness to my career. I think the biggest thing that's made a difference is I married really well. My wife has been really up for adventures and risks, and really when I've stumbled, I mean, LinkedIn makes you look kind of all up and to the right, but I've certainly had stumbles. I recovered quickly. The short of it is, you and I, as you mentioned, met at eBay and then worked together at eBay and PayPal. I almost didn't come to eBay. I was working in Chicago. I'd done a startup. It mostly failed in that we kind of sold it, but not for much. And I sold it to Amazon, but not for much. And I ended up coming to join eBay in 2002, in large part because 2 people I had worked for at Pepsi when I was a puppy were early at eBay. And Israel, you'll probably know Brian Sweetie and also Bill Cobb. And then the short of it was when I was at eBay, I met this woman who was very early in her career coming out of the government, who just joined Google, named Sheryl Sandberg. And Sheryl ended up, building the ads platform at Google. And when I was at eBay, we bought a lot of keywords back in the early days. Matter of fact, not many people know this, the infrastructure for the ingestion of keywords that Google had to build was in large part helped built by engineers from eBay, because we had such an appetite for keywords that they couldn't ingest them all in their early days. But I got to know Sheryl, and then when you and I were together at PayPal, someone who's on my team, the marketing team at PayPal, was early at Facebook, a graphic designer. And I met Mark when he was Zuckerberg. I met Mark when he was, he'll joke about this, still in flip-flops, and he was, 21. And so that was, I ended up going to Google, and then, Facebook, and I'm going to each of these if you want to, but Facebook in large part, I had on again, off again conversations with Mark for 6 years before he really wanted to hire a CMO, and then joined there in 13 and left in the end of 18. Yeah. But I almost did move. My wife and I almost did move to California. It was a lot of this is serendipitous.
Great. And you're serving today on the boards of Etsy and Petco. And Petco is very different, obviously, traditional retail. What's that like?
Yeah, I mean, it is a multi-channel, omni-channel, depending on what term you want to use. In the U.S., which is our predominant market, we also have a joint venture in Mexico. We're competing against, big box like Walmart and Target, Amazon, Chewy for, pure play digital, and obviously PetSmart. But the company's really gone through a pretty big change in the last 5 years of bringing in a lot of services. So we're one of the largest vet providers, a lot of other, services for dogs and cats and companion animals, as we call them, and things like that. So, it's been a big transition. Ron Coughlin, the guy who's the CEO, he and I worked together at Pepsi back in the early 90s. We know each other. I helped hire him. And that's my connection to Petco is, Ron and I go back. And by the way, it's a similar thing with Etsy. I as you kind of, I'm sure Josh, but
right.
Josh and you and I all worked together at eBay together. And when he became the CEO of Etsy, asked me to join the board there. So the boards I'm involved with, I love the colleagueship. It's really great. And then the CEOs I just have longstanding relationships with.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about the market and the market opportunities. So you've spent in your entire career in consumer businesses, marketing businesses. And like I said before, you've seen a lot of disruption, right? A lot of companies that change the way that we interact with each other, interact with data, etc. But on a recent call, you said something really interesting that surprised me. You said that you think that some of the biggest disruptions are yet to come.
Yeah.
Can you share a little bit more about what you meant by that?
Well, yeah, we're just a generation into the internet, and that's not a lot of time, actually. There's a great, Larry Pageism, which is, one of the co-founders of Google, which is we tend to overestimate the short term and underestimate the long. And I do think, my wife and I have twin boys. Both are working in tech now. They're 25. And when I talk to them about the things that they're working on, the things they're thinking about, it really is early days. I mean, certainly in the last 6 months with the launch of ChatGPT and now Bard from Google and others, there's a lot of attention to the consumer AI applications. But certainly, for folks who are working in tech, there's a recognition that AI has been in the background really for a decade, considerably. And, Google's been working on DeepMind for quite some time. Obviously, all the work of OpenAI over the last 7-8 years, and of note, my former employer, Facebook, now Meta, has been investing in AI really pretty much since the move to mobile back in like 12, 13, and a lot of the back infrastructure that, particularly in the ads model, serves ads and also just serves content is AI driven, and I think it's yet to be, we're really, really early days in terms of the consumer application and the total business system disruption that's going to come from AI. That's an example. I do think also the role of data what's striking to me is in the, I've talked to a bunch of companies, the ability and the agility really of being able to apply data into business decision making is still nascent, and a lot of companies are still not very data driven. There's a lot of wars inside companies about the use of data and how well they're using data, and that also I think is indicative that it's early. So those are just two examples, but I'm sure there's others we could talk about.
Sure, and just one more on that. So, what about from the consumer perspective? How do you see those trends affecting really the day-to-day life of the consumer and the way they interact with shopping, with their social networks? How do you see it from their perspective, our perspective?
Well, I mean, I think we're certainly going to go through another wave of, I'm not sure what it is, I'm not smart enough to know what it is, but another wave of kind of consumer interaction with the internet. I do think we're going to come back and look at the last 10 years of us staring into what the Netflix show referred to as black mirrors into our phones and kind of think that was stupid. And I do think we're going to go to a different interface. I don't know if it's going to be glasses, embedded, whatever it might be, but I think the computing interface, it will change. You're seeing this as an example in cars. Cars are certainly a great example of where consumer interfaces are changing rapidly. I do think as you go to more autonomy, not necessarily fully autonomous, but more autonomy in driving, you're going to see more embedded in different interfaces that are happening in cars. You're kind of seeing this already in more modern cars. And that's just an example of how consumer interfaces are changed. Therefore, I think the nature of entertainment, content as relates to entertainment, every time there is a significant change in some computing platform, there then tends to be a pretty significant change in consumer interfaces. You kind of think about, when did Instagram launch? It's when the iPhone camera got great. When did TikTok launch? It's when video and broadband came to a point and people were used to feeds to a point where that became, highly distributed and people were able to create content. So in each of those cases, you have to think, what is the technology enabling that provides a benefit to consumers en masse, and how do those things intersect, and what's the opportunity?
Yeah, very interesting. So now taking a step sideways, I guess, a little bit, you've got a lot of experience in the B2C world and kind of rolling out new technologies and bring companies to the modern age. Unlike B2B, where it's kind of like your boss says you're using this technology and you're stuck with it, and you have somewhat of a control environment. How do you kind of control rolling out technology to consumers where you don't know how they'll react, and you're still a brand that has to retain your reputation and name?
Yeah, I think let's take it in two parts. I think it's very different in things that are, hardware oriented versus things that are software oriented. This is kind of proving the point to the extreme, but I remember Sheryl Sandberg telling a story about talking to the CEO of Delta Airlines. She's like, why is your in-flight service so spotty, or whatever it is? And he said, well, the most important thing we have to do is to land the plane. Like that's where everything is kind of designed to kind of, let's land the plane. Let's take off well, let's land well. Those are two important things. And we can't fail there. And that's indicative of, when you're dealing with putting cars on the road, or even for the fact of safety of hardware devices, has a different scrutiny as it should than software does. Software tends to be, the cycle times can be faster. The danger of being wrong is not certainly as high as it is in the examples I just gave. And so I think the opportunity to just kind of, to iterate quickly, try things out is really vital. The other thing that certainly, modern marketing, which is what I focused on, provides is the ability to, create test and learn models very, very quickly, geographic or cohort, testing beds very quickly, that allows you to, again, iterate and learn much faster than than I could when I was doing new products at Pepsi, as an example.
Very cool. Very interesting. Now, a lot of startups on this call today would probably love to work with some of the companies that, on your CV. What are some of the things that
I could warn you against a couple, but keep going. No,
that's something you learn with experience. So what are some of the things that startups should be careful about when approaching the US market in terms of startups towards corporates?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have been pitched a lot. I used to listen to pitches. I actually fairly often. I found it very valuable to meet 2 or 3 people a week who are outside where I worked, because I learned a lot that way. And but you're asking for people's time, and I do find that a bunch of the pitches that I would get were quite myopic, or even to the point of arrogant, in the sense that they are convinced that whatever they're working on is the most important thing. And it may be to them. But, I'll give the most recent example. I'm the CMO of Facebook. I'm solving things every day that have to do with Facebook. You need to tailor what you're pitching to me in that way. And I was blown away by the amount of pitches I would get that were trying to solve a problem I didn't have, or presenting a problem I didn't have. So that comes first. The other, I think, is and I've seen this a bunch, is just really kind of perseverance, which is so vital, I think, in starting up a company. I mean, you have so many setbacks and twists and turns, things like that. Is that when I find, from a business development standpoint and from a founder pitch standpoint, you do just have to keep on people, because I have a window of time in a given week. I'll meet with you. I've got a bunch of follow-ups. It is also surprising, and it sounds overly simplistic, the number of people who don't follow up very well is kind of extraordinary. Or maybe I have a meeting with someone and I've asked them to send me something to follow up, or something specific about an article they might have mentioned, or a piece of content they might have mentioned, and they don't follow up very well, or they just don't. It's kind of striking. So I think making sure, and it can be simple as just to kind of go to the solving the problem of this is, once let's say you and I were going to have a meeting about something, for you to send me a note and say, hey, Gary, related to this particular arena, for example, what are the 2 or 3 things you're wrestling with the most right now? You can just ask me. Like, you don't have to guess. You can just ask me, and can send you a note back, and then we could have that conversation, and then follow up, etc. But it's it's similar to when you're pitching VCs, and a little bit different with a VC pitch, which I've done a bunch of those. But you do have to meet people where they are, and you do have to help solve someone's problem. And I have found a number of founders who are just so caught up in what they're doing, which they need to be, but you need to present yourself differently when you're then trying to get business done.
Right. So you're saying they need to basically raise their head. I mean, heads down to work, but also raise their head and see where they are, in the space of things, what your problems are, not just assume.
Right. Exactly.
And just to build on that, Gary, with a lot of what we find with early stage startups, especially, those actually do a good job and connect with large enterprise customers. Sometimes there's a danger of actually getting a yes from the big corporate clients in the early days, sort of getting a bear hug. Getting. Have you had any experience in that? Any tips to startups on how to handle these exciting situations of getting a yes by Facebook, by Amazon, by Target? How to?
Yeah, I mean, I've dealt with this as running startups. You do have to be really careful. I mean, you can get absorbed into the Borg and waste a lot of time. I mean, just because you've got just as an example, just because you have a deal in handshaked, or like a good BD conversation, doesn't mean you have a contract, doesn't mean that it's implemented. And the money and time you burn between those points can be significant. So I do think one of the things that boards are supposed to help with, venture capitalists are supposed to help with, is game planning, and the sense, okay, let's choose your example, Israel. It's like, okay, so you're going to have this deal with Target. Great. Let's figure out, what all needs to happen to have that happen. But how do we think about how much time and resources we're going to put into this deal, and what happens if we don't get it? I mean, I have an actual example from the startup I mentioned earlier, where we were working with a very large company, and they literally dragged us out for a long period of time, in part to then kill us. So, altruism is not universal. So, I won't name the company, but we ended up suing them and lost, actually, in part because the venue was their home venue. You just have to be, I know that sounds overly cynical, and I don't consider myself a cynic, but you do have to be very cautious. And one way to think about that, granted, you're dealing with, limited resources in a startup, and you as a founder in particular, or working with co-founders, divide and conquer is just like a huge thing. If too many people in a given small company are working on the same thing, that could be an issue. That's one of the things you really have to do as an early leader is figure out how to allocate people's time really wisely.
Great. Going back to some of the practical tips that you started mentioning before for the audience here, which are startups.
Yeah.
One thing you mentioned on the call that we had is the whole simplification versus complexification. Again, we, as venture capitalists, we get these 20, 25 page decks trying to pitch the company.
Yeah. What
is an effective way, I think, to communicate with busy executives in the US?
Yeah, I do think there's a bunch of examples. One thing I come to all the time, and I'm just going to hit a point I made earlier, is I think about this with consumer advertising. Whatever you think is really, really important, I promise you the consumer's spending a lot less time thinking about it than you are. And so the preciousness that you kind of deal with sometimes of how you're pitching something or communicating something, complication is your enemy. And I do think, they made up a term as related like decomplexifying is just a really important thing, simplification. But I do think, I don't call it simplification simply because we are dealing with pretty complex things. I mean, software, hardware, business systems are very complex things, but the ability to narrow it down, I think, is really vital. And so as a result, in terms of the pitch, it's thinking in kind of layers, and not to think about it in terms of writing ad copy, but headlining and being very benefit oriented is just crucial. I don't want marketees. I don't want a lot of flowery language. I want you to think about something that's very succinct, very benefit oriented. And what I'll give you one thing. I earlier in my career, we kind of skipped over, but I was at McKinsey for 4 years out of business school. One of the things I learned at McKinsey is the ability to kind of flip arguments, which is when we're trained logically, it's a deductive model. If this, then that, therefore this. And benefit consumer marketing communication in general is very benefit, which actually starts with something declarative and then supportive. And so the way that we're all normally kind of write business documents sometimes buries the lead, as they say in journalism, doesn't get to the point kind of very early. And very good salespeople, as an example, talk about things having to do with driving the benefit up front and then being smart about how to knock away rejection and get ahead of those issues in advance. And I think this relates to everything from the kind of core benefit you're communicating. I think it has a lot to do with how you think about pricing, as an example, not making it too complex. I mentioned just a moment ago, we talked about, Israel used the example of Target. How do you actually work with developing business terms or ways to go get to contract that's very turnkey as a way to to not make it hard to do business with you. All these things are really vital to get yourself the attention of, and then the commitment and the delivery of whatever business relationship you're working on.
Great. Any questions from the audience?
I don't think we have any yet so far.
Keep your cards and letters coming.
Yeah. I think something that Israel asked you earlier that you kind of answered in terms of startups that are approaching corporates and they, waste your, I don't want to say waste, but take your time and resources and then get to a no. What do you recommend for startups who actually do that and get the yes? I mean, how, if they're not ready for it, but they think they are.
Yeah, you kind of skipped over one that's really important. I do think, it would be better in the world. And I had this actually happen recently where I was pitching someone something having to do with an effort I'm doing in the U.S. having to do with political polarization and trying to reduce political polarization in the U.S. And someone gave me a fast no. It was great. It was fine. And I appreciate the fact that they just very quickly said, hey, this is not my thing. I'm not going to do that. Good luck. I'm like, okay, fine. That's fine. They're adults. That's good. So I do think making sure you're really getting understanding of if it's really leading to a yes is okay. And by the way, it's actually okay to ask. I'm just struck by a lot of times the fact that people make assumptions about things or are too scared to ask the business development person something that's more of a direct question. I think it respects each other's time, and those are the kinds of people you want to work with as it is. Maybe because of the experiences I've had, I'm always suspicious of someone who keeps on having meetings without any progression. There's a great, when I was at Facebook, Facebook and campus is a lot like a college campus, and there's a lot of posters around and things like that. And there's this great poster of a rocking horse, rocking horse a kid has. And it says, don't mistake motion for progress. That's just a great way to think about it. So to the point of then, doing these deals and getting these deals done. Again, I do think the other piece of advice that I really love, when I was in grad school and business school at Northwestern, a woman named Debbie Coleman, who was the first CFO of Apple, came to speak. And I didn't normally go to a lot of those things. I think I was too busy doing partying or something. I don't know. But she had this phrase where she said, "Don't take no from someone who can't say yes." And I do think getting to the person in an organization who can say yes on something is another thing to think about. Like, are you really talking to the person who can say yes? And then driving through to that point as well. So.
Great. Right. So we're starting to get some questions for the audience. So roll up your sleeves, Gary. Let's
yeah, let's do it.
So one question. So you suggested before that we start by asking the executives, so you in this case, what are the key issues, challenges? So what are? Yeah. Can you name one or two issues that interest you today?
Well, I'll steer clear of U.S. politics because I've been spending a lot of time in that realm. But that is certainly something I'm thinking about. I think getting back to something I mentioned earlier, I'm still struck because I've been mostly a marketer. When I've talked to other heads of marketing or other like chief business officer people, how much they are still working in the old ways of working. Like if you ask them, who do you most interact with, or who reports to you? Give a specific example. I'm keeping it back as a chief marketing officer point. I'm always still struck by the fact that the data operations people, or the data scientists, or the people who help drive fast learning don't report to the CMO. And maybe like back when we all used to work in office buildings, they don't even sit near them. They're in a different building. They're maybe a different organization. And that is, broadly speaking, I've been talking to a company right now that's looking to hire a CMO, and they're looking for someone who's data driven. There still is, people will say that they are, but when you actually get down to the point of like, how do you actually work? How much time do you spend with whom you spend it with, it's very telling. So I a little bit to the point of the earlier thing we were talking about, which is it's early days. I do think it's early days organizationally as well, and I would think a lot about that, and a little bit to meld the topics. When you're also trying to do business with someone, understanding their organization is important, obviously from a business development standpoint, like just, who does the deal and who do you think about? But it's also really important to understand their organization from an implementation standpoint. Like how do decisions get made? How does work get done? Who says yes to what? All those things are really, really, really important. And I think those are the things I think a lot about when I go work with companies is how does information get shared? How do, CMOs, chief business officers, how do they make decisions? Who do they have around themselves? How well are they insulated for shock, like somebody leaving, organizational people development? Those are the things I actually find. Certainly as I've gotten more senior in organizations, I spent a lot more time thinking about those things.
So you're saying that decomplexifying applies to the organizational structure also, not to the deals.
Yeah. It's a good theme. Yeah. I mean, I'll give you one example because I think it's very telling. When I joined Facebook in 2013, we had about 40 people in the marketing organization. Not to talk about org size, but it was about 10 times that when I left 5.5 years later. The company grew, super fast, and marketing, particularly product marketing, grew very, very fast. And Mark was like this broadly. At any given time, anybody in my organization could be meeting with Mark. I rarely had a meeting before the meeting with Mark. But the agreement I had with Mark was if something went wrong in that meeting with someone junior in my organization, and even if a direct report, he wouldn't get mad at me about it. He would want to understand like what my point of view is, or were we going to come back and fix something or whatever it was. But the ability to move fast and not have the meeting before the meeting, I see this everywhere. It's not just large companies. It starts to happen anytime you get to like 100 people. That's where it all starts to happen. And you really have to bang that out. And one of the things that really impressed me, particularly about Facebook and the way Mark works, is information just flows very, very fast. And you don't feel the risk as a senior executive of allowing that to happen. You would want that to happen because it's actually not only really energizing, it also develops your people really fast. And you get a sense very, very quickly of like who's really strong and who can stretch and who can grow with the twos and fro's of an organization versus those that can't. So, there's a need for hierarchy. It serves a purpose, but I think making sure the information and content flows really fast in an organization is vital and still not really done by a lot of companies.
It's interesting.
Let's take the next one. All right. 1 second. All right, just rolling up. So this is a good one. So the relationship between and the integration of sales and marketing teams is bringing up a lot of discussion about the impact, how impact should be measured, and what you see is the top metrics that smart marketing organizations should be measuring against.
Yeah, I think that, well, there's two questions there. Sales is rather straightforward, and I'll link it to marketing in a second. Sales is sales, and I mean to make this overly, but like, there's lots of good software and lots of companies that think about pipeline and understanding, putting probabilities against those things and measuring those things to get to, what is the mathematical expected outcome, and that is what it is. One of the things that isn't very much thought about, but I think is really vital in brand marketing and then in sales is momentum, which is the simple question we used to ask at Facebook is we'd ask consumers and we'd ask, buyers, business buyers, like people who are buying our things, are Facebook's best days ahead or behind? And it's a very, very simple way to understand momentum. The other, particularly for large companies, is not very relevant for small companies, is do people want you to succeed? Do they think that Facebook or Google or whomever, getting bigger is a good thing or not? But best days ahead is a really important one. Trust, obviously, I'm not trying to be, sarcastic, but trust is super important, particularly in consumer brands. It can go away very, very fast. and I think treating that well. And the reason for that is very much connected to momentum is the ability to innovate in the sense that will consumers or businesses adopt, accept, endorse the innovations you create. And to this point of best days ahead, and do they want you to win? And so trust is absolutely highly correlated to innovation and the ability to innovate and people accepting it. And then certainly as it relates to the product itself, so I kind of went I went into the areas of talking about momentum and then kind of corporate brand or reputation for the company. And then from a product marketing standpoint, certainly, we would spend a lot of time thinking about time spent and also this idea of time well spent. So one is a very objective function of just literally minutes, seconds in a day that people are spending time with your software. And then when people do that, do they think it's well spent? Do they actually get value out of it away? And those are all measures that we measured when I was at Facebook. All the things I just mentioned.
So actually coming from Facebook, I think that's a very big, very interesting point where you're saying, especially in the early days, when you said kind of building trust with consumers, how would you suggest a startup build trust, especially when they're like, the very early scrappy stage where they have a crappy website, they have like a buggy product.
Yeah.
Like what could they do to really build trust?
Yeah, I do find I come back a lot again to like the old book of everything I ever needed to know I learned in kindergarten or something like that, whatever it was. There is a big part to doing what you say you're going to do. And trust very much comes from that. As it relates to, when I'm working with organizations and business executives, how well do you use people's time, money, attention? Do you do what you say you're going to do? Who do you surround yourself with? That's very important. If you're a leader in a company, who are your directs? How strong are they? If you're a company that is trying to grow itself, it is one of the reasons that venture capital reputation is so important. It's like if I'm getting invested by, somebody on my board is X or Y, that tends to have credence to it, and certainly, we're all familiar with that. So, but it is really extraordinary still, just because I've done this for a while, of how much people don't follow up and don't do what they say they're going to do. It's kind of striking. One quick aside, just because I was looking down to the corner, and I appreciate the fact that Shay has a comment about trying to meet with me in San Francisco this Thursday, Friday. I actually live off the coast of Seattle, but I love the fact that everybody, and granted I was with a lot of Bay companies, but I have a funny side story, which is that I did a startup in Chicago prior to moving to Silicon Valley, 25 years ago. And we moved away from there when our kids got basically in the middle of college and moved out of Silicon Valley when I left Facebook. But some venture capitalist I was pitching was like, yeah, why don't you come by? We'll get a sandwich tomorrow afternoon. It's like, I'm in Chicago. There's just always an assumption of the Bay Area stuff. Anyway.
So we're really talking to an audience of Israeli tech companies for the most part here.
Yeah.
I guess one of the questions that a lot of people are thinking is, where do you see, consumer technologies going to, or where do you see a gap in needs for technologies that haven't been met yet?
I do think one of the things I think that is interesting about AI is the ability to simplify interfaces. We think about this a lot as it relates to, it was a little bit to one of the questions that was kind of being asked, which is around being on the boards of Etsy and Petco. We think a lot about, chat interfaces, I can't get into more details, but like other relatable interfaces that use the power of the device to make the shopping experience more directed, more positive serendipity on where you're kind of find items or find things or find services that you otherwise wouldn't. In the case of Petco, scheduling, rescheduling, because obviously, life happens and things change. So I think the interface opportunities can still be a lot simpler. It's one of the reasons, if you kind of read a little bit about what it is that Microsoft's trying to do with Bing and ChatGPT versus what how Google thinks about it with Bard, is clearly Google is thinking that the interface structures are about to change significantly, and that's a big area for disruption for them. As companies that are in and around those businesses, there's positive things that can happen from that, but there's also a blast radius that can happen from that too. And so you have to kind of think about who you're partnering with, what technologies you're embedding, and again, how do you make interfaces much more straightforward and less difficult. And you're seeing this all over the place. I mean, we kind of bypass it, but the ability to credential on a mobile device, if you go back 10 years ago, that was super hard. And it was very, difficult. Israel and I go back to PayPal days of like the early days of digital money with PayPal. How much easier it is now to, not only tap and pay in the real world, but kind of check out, and not only just check out, but then the after purchase experience. Shopify's done a great job with this. But again, I still think those developments can get even easier, and a lot of the technologies that have yet to get developed or are in the process of being developed because of changes in interfaces and particularly with artificial intelligence and machine learning to make the stuff smarter, I think there's lots of opportunity.
Great. So Gary, going to wrap up in a minute or two. But one final kind of fun question.
Someone wrote, "I will come to Seattle just for you." Oh, that's funny. Good for you, Shay.
That's great. I'll bring a cup of coffee. So any suggestions for a recent book or podcast that you like listening to stay up to speed on technology, business? So
the one blog I read, which I think is the best money I spend all year, is Ben Thompson's Stratechery. If folks aren't familiar with it, it's STRATECHERY, Stratechery. And he is really bright, not just because he's a Northwestern Kellogg grad, but I just think it's the best thing I kind of see. I read, I'm fortunate to know Fred Wilson. I read Fred's blog. I read Reid Hoffman's work because I think Reid's such a great founder and thinker. Those are probably the things but frankly, that's kind of it for me. I find I was kind of in it and so deep in it for so long. I listen to like comedy stuff and things that have nothing to do with tech a bunch too. Yeah.
Awesome, David. Gary, this has been amazing. Thanks for spending the time with us. But just before we wrap up, we have a couple of announcements.
Yes. So you want to next? Okay. So thanks everyone for joining us. We had a great conversation with Gary. Thank you so much. Our next live stream is going to be with Dr. Justin Graham, who is the head of informatics and clinical strategy at Store Number 8, which is a stealth healthcare venture inside of Walmart. Dr. Graham has spearheaded digital transformation AI inside several large U.S. healthcare enterprises, including Anthem and Hearst Health, as well as multiple startups. And we'll be discussing with him the ways that Israeli CEOs can optimize the success of their digital health startups in the U.S. Also, join our WhatsApp group that we have for basically where we're kind of conveying corporate needs as we get them. If for details, message us or visit avivgrowth.com and look for the WhatsApp prompt. Thank you so much, Gary. It was very insightful.
Thanks, everyone. See you next time.
Bye-bye. For joining.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Ready to join Khan? חדשות.